recognised as one of the best of his generation.
A lot of people started putting it into my head that it was prejudice, you know, like colour came into it, you know, because I was, you know, like half caste, I suppose, but they wouldn't admit that, you know.
Wally and I grew up in the boys' home together, and he would be the greatest athlete I've ever seen in my life. And I used to go out and watch him train and watch him run, and he used to beat everybody. And the Aborigines weren't allowed to be in the state athletics teams in South Australia and in the other team. Victoria wouldn't accept him and South Australia wouldn't put him in. That's why he turned professional.
The professional body came up to me and they said, look, we'll look after you if you turn pro. And they did look after me real good before I went to England. The first 10 races I ran as a pro, I won 10 of them. One of them was against Frank Banner. He was the Australian professional sprint champion. They flew him from Sydney here to Adelaide. I ran against him on the, you know, one of the football ovals there, Norwood Oval. And he gave me 4-yard start. I beat him by 6. I ran away from him.
Denied an amateur career in his own country, Wally MacArthur came to England and made his name as a professional athlete and a brilliant rugby league player. Signed up by the Rochdale Hornets, his shared record of goals and tries stands today, and is still remembered as the fastest winger in rugby league.
When I arrived there, I mean, I wasn't looking for recognition or anything like that, but I got the paper next day, you know, like, and there's a photo on the front page, and it had headlines, "Black Flash on way to England." And I thought, hey, gee whiz. I looked at my skin, you know, I said, I'm not that black, am I, surely? But anyway, that was in London, the London Times, and then I got on the train and went up to Manchester. I got cameras was there waiting on it, and I got off the train, and photo on the front page of the Manchester, you know, news, and it had coffee-coloured boy from South Australia arrives in, you know, in Manchester. And I thought, gee whiz, I'm black in one paper and coffee-coloured in the other one, you know. When I was a professional in England, I won the Northern England 100 yards and 220 yards. And that same day, the Commonwealth or Empire Games were being held at Cardiff, you know, in Wales. And my times over the 100 and 220 yards was far superior than the Australian runners representing Australia at that time. They said, you know, like, only because you was in a different colour and that you should have been, you was good enough to represent Australia in the Olympic Games.
Wally was one who got away, but Australian governments had other plans for the Aboriginal people. Young talent was stifled in isolated, regimented reserves, often run by Christian missionaries. They provided a kind of nursing service for people they regarded as racially incurable. Protecting the natives, they called it. In fact, Aboriginal children fathered by whites were often forcibly taken from their mothers, and many never saw each other again. It was a policy influenced by the fascist eugenics movement. In 1933, the Secretary of the Department of the Interior wrote, "The policy of mating half-castes with whites for the purpose of breeding out the colour is that adopted by the government of Australia." The boys were sent as cheap labour to sheep and cattle stations. The girls went to training homes, where they were made into domestic servants, then given to masters in white middle-class homes. They were exploited and often abused. The historic parallel is the use of black slave girls in America. In Australia, the word slave was not used. It was only in 1997 that the truth was officially recognised, when the Human Rights Commission published this landmark report. It's since been estimated that more than 100,000 children were stolen from their families. The report by the Human Rights Commission called for an apology from the government and reparations for the victims. Prime Minister John Howard refused to make an official apology and made clear there would be no compensation. During that week, Federal Parliament spent an hour debating a proposal for a tax on the culling of emus. By contrast, the Commission's report describing genocide in Australia was given just half an hour, during which the Prime Minister, the members of his cabinet and most government MPs left before the debate was over. These black cricketers were among Australia's first sporting heroes. The first Australian cricket team to tour England was entirely Aboriginal. The year was 1868. The Daily Telegraph in London commented, "Nothing of interest comes from Australia except gold nuggets and black cricketers." But behind the faces and starched suits was an untold story of dispossession and massacre. Many Aboriginal sportsmen and women were so talented they broke through the barriers of race. In the 1930s, Eddie Gilbert, a fast bowler, was given special permission to play outside the reserve. He took 5 wickets for 65 runs against the West Indies. In 1931, he faced Donald Bradman, the world's greatest batsman, and bowled him for a duck. Bradman later wrote, "That Gilbert sent down the fastest bowling I can remember." On November the 11th, 1936, the Secretary of the Queensland Cricket Association wrote to an official called the Protector of Aborigines. "The matter of Eddie Gilbert has been fully discussed by my executive committee, and it was decided, with your concurrence, to arrange for Gilbert to return to the settlement." What he meant was that they were banishing him to a kind of concentration camp in the bush. "With regard to the cricketing clothes bought for Gilbert," wrote the Secretary, "it is asked that arrangements be made for these to be laundered and returned to this office." And that's how they solved the problem of an amazing Aboriginal cricketer who dared to be too good for his own good. Eddie Gilbert was committed to a mental asylum in Queensland, where he died, they said, of a brain disorder. The boxer Ron Richards is today regarded as one of the greatest middleweights the world never saw. He died on the Aboriginal penal settlement of Palm Island. Mal Meninga, perhaps the finest rugby league player of all time, was often the brunt of racist abuse until he scored a try. Then he was applauded. Nicky Winmar, the Australian rules football star, was the victim of so much racist abuse that on the final whistle he wrenched up his jersey and pointed with pride to his black skin. Wimbledon champion of the 1970s, Yvonne Goolagong, was caught in a double bind. Racially abused as a young girl, she was attacked by her own people for not speaking out. Jim Murray was so outstanding as a runner, footballer and boxer that he was made an honorary white man. And Cathy Freeman, the gold medalist sprinter, whose symbolic act of carrying the Aboriginal flag at the Commonwealth Games in 1994 led to its acceptance by the Australian government. In his book Obstacle Race, Professor Colin Tatz names 1,200 outstanding black Australian athletes, of whom only 5 had access to the equipment, training and facilities that white Australians take for granted.
The Aboriginal people who are going to represent Australia in the Olympics are aberrations. They're people who have shown sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times as much talent in order to rate equal and in order to rate a place. They're people who, through sheer talent, have been forced to be recognised. If we appropriate their talents, they become part of us and we look better for the whole exercise. I mean, Cathy Freeman is the greatest thing that's ever happened to white Australia in recent years, because this happy, smiling, grinning, delightful, fun-loving, life-loving young lady looks as though she is the representative of all black womanhood. She isn't. She isn't. She is an aberration.
This is a major Aboriginal football tournament in the Northern Territory. Unlike white Australia, all they have to play on is a dust bowl. The goalposts barely stand up, and there's nowhere for spectators to sit. Conditions like this are typical of Aboriginal sport, the kind you'll never find in the Olympic city. During the bidding for the Sydney Olympics, Australian officials offered two African IOC delegates scholarships worth a total of more than $100,000 at Australia's elite Institute of Sport. These were called inducements. As for the inducements for Aboriginal sport, there has been modest official help in recent years, including scholarships in the Olympic sports, many of them worth less than $5,000. That's £2,000.
I think most Australians would weep if they were taken on a tour of black sporting Australia. The IOC sent the Nigerian member of the IOC to Australia to examine conditions here, whether we were a fit and proper country to have the Olympics. I think the Nigerian gentleman would have been shocked to have taken him out to places like Kintor in the Northern Territory, to Papania, even to Yuendamu, which has an annual Aboriginal Games of great significance, where there isn't a blade of grass, where there isn't a set of goalposts, where there isn't a basketball court, worth calling a basketball court, where words like coach and track and courts and pools and physios and saunas and scholarships are just not part of the Aboriginal vocabulary. Or to the salt pan at Lombardina in the Kimberleys, where Aborigines literally play with two saplings stuck in the ground in the middle of a salt pan. If he'd have looked at those sorts of conditions, he would have been looking at third and fourth world sporting facilities. Aborigines kicking a piece of leather stuffed with paper because they haven't got footballs. I think that the IOC would have had to have put in some very adverse recommendations, or at least said to the Australian government, we will think of you as a final bidding team on condition that you repair X, Y, Z. They didn't.
I took this photograph at Jay Creek in the Northern Territory in 1969. It was my first real glimpse of the other Australia. There was no decent housing, no running water, and the children were sick. Charlie Perkins, another Aborigine derided as a half-caste, was my guide. Charlie was already a great sportsman, who, like Wally MacArthur, found a kind of refuge in England, where he had a successful football career and was selected for trials at Manchester United by Matt Busby. Instead, he returned home and became only the second Aborigine to graduate from an Australian university, and has spent his life campaigning for freedom for his people. We met again 30 years later in Sydney. You've written very movingly about your growing up. What are the memories of those very early days that still remain vivid with you?
The discrimination's just awful. The police were controlling us. If we went into the town, we'd be arrested and brought back to the compound. They called it a reserve, but it was a compound. I mean, I went to a birthday party, and we were invited, but we had to stay outside at the windows. We handed in our little presents to them, and they handed the cakes out to us. And then I was the best cricketer in